was quite an extraordinary book review of Lacy Crawford's recent book titled Notes on a Silencing. And this is one of the great things about Zoom, because Lacy is in California, but her publisher connected us, agreed that she could be here this evening, and Lacy, we are most grateful to you for saying yes to that request. Lacy Crawford is the author of fiction and nonfiction. She wrote a book, a satire titled Early Decision, which was published by Murrow in 2013. And this current book, Notes on a Silencing, was published by Little Brown earlier this year. It was a New York Times Editor's Choice that was named Best of Summer by Time, People, and Real Simple. Her literary journalism includes interviews and profiles of Frank Conroy, Reynolds Price, Jeffrey Wolfe, and Shirley Hazard. And her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, and many other outlets. Lacy lives in California with her husband and 3 children. And thank you, Lacy, for being here. So could we begin by sort of turning it over to you and having you tell us a bit about your, how this book came to be and whatever else it is you want to talk to us about for starters.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to say, first of all, that this memoir is a book that emerges from the experience I had of sexual assault when I was 15 years old and a student at a boarding school in Concord, New Hampshire. Part of the project of writing this book for me, which I did after joining a state investigation into my school about 30 years later, 25 years later, part of the project is to throw off the sort of coat of shame that I had worn ever since the night that this happened to me. And to some extent, I did that by simply telling the truth as best I could in the most articulate and authentic words I could find. What that means is that I'm pretty explicit about what was done to me, both that night and subsequently by the administration of my boarding school that did everything in its power to silence me and make the problem go away. So I do want to say that for anyone who is not up for a conversation about sexual assault this evening or ever, that maybe now is a good time to switch to debate prep or do something else. We know there's a big conversation on the stage in a couple hours. And for everyone else, I'm really comfortable talking about what happened, and I would like to encourage everybody to become comfortable talking about what happened, because I think that's one of the ways we stop this. So the Q&A button, which should be on the lower right-hand side of your screen, will enable you to type in a question at any point during this discussion. And Penny and I are going to go to questions as soon as we can. And so I would love for this to be as interactive a conversation as possible for people who are interested. And you can also send private notes, through the chat if that's something you wish to do. So with that said, I was the oldest of 2 kids from a sort of young and lucky family growing up in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and I was book smart and young and nerdy, and my parents sent me to St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, which is one of these legendary so-called elite New England boarding schools. Our latest famous alumnus is Bob Mueller, who in my experience hasn't done quite what we would have wished he would do, but he's been very prominent nevertheless. John Kerry was there, and various other people. The current chair of the board is Archibald Cox Jr., who's the son of the Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox Sr., who also went to St. Paul's, and his father also went to St. Paul's, and that's how these things work. So when I was there at the age of 15, I was effectively lured to the room of a senior, an 18-year-old senior who was in my math class. I didn't know him very well at all. He had a very serious girlfriend. And I was trapped, and he and his roommate were both there, and it was nighttime, and they forced themselves on me. I was a virgin at the time, and I had no idea really what was going on. I didn't know that something like that could happen to me. I was very lucky that I made it to age 15 without something like that happening to me. But I said to these 2 boys, once I realized that they weren't going to let me go without getting whatever it was they had lured me there for, I said, just don't have sex with me. Just don't have sex with me, because I thought that if I didn't get pregnant, I would be okay, and I wouldn't die of AIDS. That was the sum total of what I understood about assault when I was 15 years old. So instead they forced themselves down my throat one at a time. And then when they were finished, they let me go. I was fully clothed the entire time. I was very confused about what had happened. I didn't understand because I hadn't taken my clothes off. I didn't know them as boyfriends. I didn't understand. I didn't have the words for what had been done to me. And I think this is an experience that everyone who has been assaulted or molested in some way perhaps shares, which is that you're going through your everyday life and then something happens to you that is not something you've imagined could happen. And it takes a very long time to figure out that the genre of your life has just jumped the track and you're living an entirely different timeline now. I didn't tell anybody what had happened to me for about 5 months. I did, however, contract a sexually transmitted disease very deep in my throat and only in my throat. And I went continuously to the infirmary on my boarding school campus for help because I was unable to eat solid food. I lost a lot of weight. I had a high fever. The school said they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. My doctors at home couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I struggled through the next 5 months or so, and then I told my parents what had happened, and they flew me home to Chicago. Long story short, my pediatrician at home in Chicago diagnosed genital herpes very deep in my throat, reported the assault, which was a statutory assault, to the state of New Hampshire. And the police got involved, at which point the school conducted its own internal investigation and determined that what had happened to me was consensual, that there was no need to talk to the police about it, and that, by the way, I might have given the boys herpes from my throat rather than the other way around. The deal that was struck with St. Paul's School and my parents, through no choice of my parents, was this. If I agreed to work with the Concord Police Department and press charges against the boys, the two 18-year-old men who had assaulted me, the school was prepared to say all sorts of things about me on the stand to discredit me, including that I was a drug dealer, which was laughable, including that I was promiscuous, that I routinely flouted laws, rules and expectations on campus, all sorts of things. If I didn't go ahead with pressing charges, if I declined to join that, which would have made it effectively impossible for the prosecutors to do their job, then the school would let me come back for my senior year and not interfere with my applications or my process to college. That was an unwritten contract, and the experience of being slandered and shamed, there's more to it, but the experience of being slandered and shamed in the way that I was by the priests and the deans on the campus of my school blew apart my family, devastated my parents, it devastated me and the relationship between us, and it ruined me for quite a long time. But I was lucky and I was privileged, and I had therapists, and I went to graduate school and wrote a master's thesis on rape testimony in young children. And then I went to work in human rights and environmental rights organizations in London. And I worked with high school seniors all over the world as a sort of side hustle to keep myself afloat. And in 2017, I would have told you that I had put all of this behind me the way we do. And I thought in many cases that I had, in many ways that I had, but the state of New Hampshire in 2017 opened a formal investigation into St. Paul's School because there had been so many reports of assault on campus, some of which rose to national prominence in the media. People might be familiar with the case of Chessie Prout, who was sexually assaulted as a freshman by a senior named Owen Labrie, who was ultimately convicted on 3 of 5 charges and served time in prison. His Harvard admission was revoked. The alumni of St. Paul's School raised funds to pay for his defense attorney after Chessie went to the police, which she did the night of the assault. So the school hadn't changed a whole lot in the decades since I had been there. And once the state investigation was open, there was issued a call to anybody who had experience of child endangerment on the campus, because we were high schoolers. So all of us were under 18 or just 18 for the most part. I joined that investigation very privately. I told only my husband. Nobody in my life in California knew about what happened to me at boarding school. I don't know about boarding school at all. I've moved very much outside of that community and moved joyfully outside of that community for the most part. And as I was working with the Concord, New Hampshire Police Department in 2017, I told them everything I just told you. I said, you know, the boys assaulted me. They were 18. I was 15. I contracted herpes in my throat and nowhere else. And my pediatrician diagnosed it and reported it to the school and to the state of New Hampshire. And the school threatened to expel me and said I was a drug dealer and all of these crazy things. And they said, well, do you have any of that in writing. Well, of course I didn't have any of that in writing. Nobody has any of that in writing, but the school somehow found out that I was working with the state attorney general. I don't know how. And I was contacted by the school's lawyers in 2017, and they wanted to talk to me right away. And I forwarded that email to Concord Police, and I said, this is weird. Why is this happening? And on that afternoon, Concord Police, Detective Julie Curtin, who had worked in sex crimes investigations for almost 20 years at that point, drove in her squad car up to the campus of St. Paul's School and found the rector, the headmaster, in his office and asked for my student file, which was that summer 25 years old. I had not been on campus since the summer of 1992. This was the summer of 2017, and my file just happened to be sitting on the rector's desk, just right there. And he handed it to the detective, and she photographed everything inside it. And among the things she found inside my student file was the letter that the school's lawyer wrote outlining the plan for silencing me way back in the summer of 1991. How to say to my family that I would be expelled if I agreed to testify, if I did not drop the charges. How to tip off the boys' parents that a reportable event had been communicated to the state of New Hampshire, and that the school was not supportive of that. A whole map, a roadmap really, for making sure that a 16-year-old girl, because I was by that point 16, had absolutely no say or no recourse. And the police couldn't believe what they had found, and they took it to the state office and they said, this is exactly what you're looking for. They took it to the attorney general and said, this is what we have opened this investigation into St. Paul's School to try to find. You know, after decades of stories about assaults being buried on campus, about witness tampering, obstruction of justice, child endangerment, here it is on the page. We know the assault happened. We know the lawyer counseled witness tampering. We know what the administrators did. And the Attorney General severed the Concord Police Department from my case and refused to consider my case and would not even assemble a new file himself and gave no reasonable explanation for why this was. So I received a phone call from the Concord Police. I was 42 years old, living here in my house with my husband and my children and participating quietly in this traumatic investigation. And the police said, we've never seen anything like this. We've been on the force for 25 years, 20 years, they said, and we've never been treated this way. We don't know what's going on. They refuse to accept your case. They won't look at any of the files, even the original criminal case file from 1991. We don't know what to do. And it was clear to me that I was being silenced for a second time. I wasn't quite sure why, but I knew that the school had gotten away with it once and the school was going to try to get away with it again. And I thought I couldn't survive it if I let them silence me again. So I began to write very quickly. And by the spring of 2018, we had a couple more pieces of information about my case and who exactly they were protecting. And the state agreed to a settlement agreement with the school, in which no charges were brought, and everything was closed and everything disappeared. So had I not been given the access to my files that the police gave me, had I not written this book, none of this story would ever have made it out into the public. The book itself is not so much about the assault, which is a very common everyday assault, happens all the time. The book is about how a community managed to work to try to make it go away. And this is something that happens in educational institutions all over the country. It happens in branches of the military. Certainly it happens in the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. It happens in other faith communities. And it seems to me that where the Me Too conversation has brought us is the wonderful space of being able to say what has been done to us, and I hope saying it without shame. But where we are now is needing to pay real attention to the organizations and institutions and leaders that allow this to persist, because it's my sense that if they wanted to stop it, they could. So that's a lot of information in a very short period of time, and it makes the book sound, somebody asked me on Twitter the other day if my book was like an episode of CSI, like Law and Order, like I don't know, is it, I'm not sure, like I don't watch, anyway, Penny, you tell me. I think, you know.
I don't watch it either, but you do talk a lot about the kind of culture, the St. Paul's and what it's like to be in a school like that. Now, it's probably somewhat similar to some of the high schools that we went to, but really magnified. I mean, that place had a wicked kind of social hierarchy. Can you, and even though you were privileged, you were not high up on the.
Oh, I had no. I mean, this is something that I grew up in the Midwest, and I definitely was privileged. I was my father worked in investment banking by the time I was a young adolescent. My mom was an Episcopal priest, and we lived in a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, and we were sent to private schools, and I graduated without debt, and I had everything I could ever want. I am not a legacy trust fund child. I don't come from families that, you know, have summer houses all over the place. It's a very different experience. It sounds like I'm splitting hairs, and I am, especially given the economic inequality that we're facing right now nationwide. St. Paul's is like a tiny college. It is 2,000 acres in the New Hampshire woods with its own ponds and its own dam. And when the ponds freeze over, they put boards up and the kids skate on them, and they're brought out hot chocolate by the teams of people who work in the kitchen and who serve us 3 meals a day, most of whom have some sort of are sort of alternative learners or not mainstreamed individuals who are in alternate employment settings. So they are serving the children of the elite, helmeted or in some way protected from us and from themselves in a way that is grotesque. And the experience of being there was of being either a legacy scion, and there were plenty of those, or being given the opportunity to join that community if you did everything right, you know, if you did everything right. So, I mean, a third of my class went to the Ivy League, MIT or Stanford, a third.
I read somewhere when I was looking up your school that, you know, ambassadors, congressmen, senators,
Everybody.
Nobel laureates, everybody. I mean, it was quite a place. But the other significant thing is that when you went there, it had only been 15 years since that institution had become co-ed, and you were a girl going there. So what was that like? Because I mean, you didn't remember when it wasn't co-ed, but that culture must have kind of persisted.
Goodness, if only I had known. I mean, so I was born in 75, and I was probably the first generation that was told we could actually do anything we wanted, right? And have a glimmer of hope that that might be true. So it didn't occur to me that St. Paul's was a place built for boys, because everything in my life was built for boys, and that was something that I was very accustomed to. The campus was dominated then, and I think still is now, by the members of the ice hockey and the lacrosse teams, most of whom tended to overlap with the families that had donated a lot of the money and were sending 3rd or 4th generation kids to St. Paul's School. Their names are on the buildings. Their names are carved in the walls. They would go to special camps together, you know, in advance of sports seasons in Bermuda. The amount of money, the secret clubs, the sense that you had walked into almost like a science fiction novel, a world where everybody already knows everything, and the protocols are so clear and yet utterly unspoken. And one of the things that was very common, so this wasn't in the book because I had actually forgotten it, and an alumnus a year ahead of me after my book came out, I've been flooded with alumni notes, and someone said, "Do you remember they used to call us beeves?" This is true. So a girl on the campus was called a beeve. That's short for beaver. That's actually just what the boys called us. We were beeves, guys and beeves. It didn't occur to me when I was 14 that there was anything wrong with that. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't understand what they were referring to. There was a ritual of our seated meal. So every night we had a formal seated meal. Girls were in dresses and boys were in coat and tie. We had assigned seats at a grand dining hall that looked like Oxford, you know, with a high table where the masters would be, and we were waited on, actually. People lowered plates in front of us. And when we left seated meal, we had to walk through a common room, and only the seniors could sit on one side of the common room. And they rated all the girls to 2 decimal points every single night. And this was normal, that you dressed up for it. This was 4 nights a week. This was absolutely normal. I was devastated because I never scored very high. Some of my friends were astonishingly beautiful girls and are now astonishingly beautiful women, and I longed to have high ratings. So what I want to depict is that I didn't go and say, God, these are a bunch of sexist, toxic, you know, masculine boys. What I wanted was to be one of the girls who got 10s. That's what I wanted, and I didn't know enough to know that beeve was not an appropriate term, and frankly, neither did most of the boys, because that was the environment the school fostered.
I mean, it seems that, you know, cruelty exists everywhere, but I am struck in your book by, in my view, what happened to you, your assault, was on an equal par with the cruelty that people displayed toward you. And for you, not knowing who knew, who didn't know, what did they know, being shunned. I mean, Lacy, that must have been completely devastating.
Well, the thing that happened immediately thereafter, and I'm a writer, and books and narrative have been my passion for as long as I can remember. And so I do think of it with a bit of an analytic eye. A fascinating thing happened, which is that I was assaulted. I've described that to you. I was held down. One of the boys, the one who had called me, was drafted into the NHL straight out of St. Paul's. Okay, he was, I think, 6'6". I'm 5'7". He was a foot taller than I was. He was 3.5 years older than I was. He outweighed me by 100 pounds. There was nothing I could have done, and his roommate was there too. I mean, there was nothing I could have done, and so I did what most of us do, which is you try to get out of something with the least amount of damage to you possible. You know, just don't have sex with me, just don't kill me. Here, take my purse, take whatever you need, but let me live. And that's what I did. And I did not have words for it. They let me go. I climbed back out the window. I walked slowly back to my dorm. It was late at night. I took a shower. I didn't tell anyone, and they told everyone. So by the next night, in that seated meal scene that I've described for you, I walk out of the dining hall and I hear some hockey players say threesome. I didn't know what the word threesome meant. I'm quick, I figured it out, right? But the story was theirs before it was mine. Long before it was mine. When I went to the infirmary and opened my mouth because I couldn't eat, the infirmary couldn't see anything in my throat because the sores were too far down. When they sent me to an actual physician in Concord, New Hampshire, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, they diagnosed me with genital herpes, and they communicated that to the infirmary on campus. And the infirmary did not tell me, or my doctors at home, or my parents, what I had. What that meant was I remained untreated, so that I had open sores in my throat and a fever for most of the year. And what that meant was that they knew that I had been assaulted, because when my pediatrician finally diagnosed it in Chicago, she said, this is clinical evidence, you know, of an assault. It's obvious. And the school knew that. So all of these other people understood certain truths of what had happened, or their version of the truth of what had happened. And it truly wasn't until I wrote this book that I was able to tell it the way it happened to me.
But Lacy, not only, okay, so this assault happened, but then in the time ahead, you had lost, it seems, you know, a sense of, you took on, obviously, a shame that you didn't deserve. And it really, it led you to do things that later you regretted because you had no sense of your own self.
I did, yeah, no, I did. I went off the rails, and I wanted to depict this in the book because it's not a story that I had seen, and it would have helped me as a girl. So after this assault, I was suddenly famous on campus because I was a girl in the choir. I had freckles. I don't know if you can tell the wrinkles now, cover them up. But I had freckles across my face. I was sort of strawberry blonde ponytail, and I desperately wanted a cool boyfriend. I didn't have a cool boyfriend, and I appeared to be a girl who turned up in seniors' rooms in the middle of the night and performed fellatio on both of them. I mean, this is good gossip, you know, for a cold October at a New England boarding school. And I developed a kind of reputation. And what this meant was that boys started trailing me around, trying to get things from me. So one of them said, you know, I'm going to pop your cherry. I'm going to take your virginity. And at that point, it was so clear I was being mocked that they were imagining a fantasy of innocence that I no longer had because they knew what had happened to me. I didn't really know what had happened to me. I understood logistically what went where, but I did not understand what had been done to my sense of self-respect, my integrity, my ability to protect myself and defend myself. I was pretty sure that I would not be believed or defended if I spoke up, and I was right, because when I finally did, the school moved to silence me. But it very quickly became the case that I wanted there to be nothing about me that was of any interest to a boy. That if you want to take my virginity, fine, you can have my virginity, just leave me alone, whatever it is, take it and leave me be. You know, it's as though you've been mugged and you say, I will never wear my jewelry again. I don't want jewelry. I want to be safe. That's what I want. And so what was destroyed for me was any sense that my body was anything other than a vulnerability, and that all I could do was try to stem the loss. That's all I could do. And there was, a couple months later, there was an alumnus of the school who had graduated. He was at an Ivy League school. I hadn't known him at all. He was the son of a trustee, and he had heard all about me, and he drove down from his college campus, and we had no locks on our doors in our dorms. None of the dorms, none of, like, girls, you know, Gothic dorms full of girls sleeping every night in the middle of New Hampshire with no locks. We weren't allowed to lock our doors. It was a fire danger, they said. And he came in through my door in the middle of the night. It was cold. I remember the cold falling off the shoulders of his coat. I didn't know who he was. I didn't have the light on. There was a man on my bed. I had a single room. I was 1,000 miles from my parents. We had no cell phones, obviously. This was 1990, you know, 91. There was a payphone in the basement. Anyway, one learns to do things that one has to do to stay safe, and one no longer fights for things that she feels she can't afford anymore, like, you know, chastity or morality. I just wanted to get through alive. And that, of course, was used against me later by the school. They said, she's promiscuous. They left out the part that I didn't become, quote, promiscuous until the night I was assaulted, which is really straightforward. But one of the most remarkable responses I've had to this book has come from women who have said, you know, there was a girl in high school. They'll tell me there was a girl who she just became kind of that girl. And they all remember that girl. They remember her name. And they say, now that I read your book, I know what happened to her. Like, I'm sure I know what happened, you know, because we don't change overnight our relationship to our bodies and our desire in that way. It's a traumatic response. And that's what it was for me. So yeah, it was a kind of hell. But, you know, my grades didn't drop, and I was still a 3-varsity athlete, and my parents didn't know a thing, you know, right. And that's what I was optimizing for, was to be a good girl.
Right. There were a couple of people who seemed sort of heroic. I mentioned this to you, and I was so moved by your stories about your interactions with somebody like Alex, who did sort of help you provided a pivotal moment, right? I mean, okay, things didn't get much better for years, but there were people who were really good people in your life, right?
So Alex is the pseudonym I have for this boyfriend I had as a senior, and yes, I do think it's possible that he saved my life. So I went back to St. Paul's School for my senior year. I was young for my class. I was 16 at that point, and as I've said, the deal was that as long as I didn't press charges and my family agreed to drop everything they had said about the assault and the STD and the police report, that the school would not interfere with my progress to college. What that meant was I was pretty much free to do anything the hell I wanted. And I was the only one who could do that. So the school knew I was untouchable, but that did not feel like freedom. That felt like an absence of care. It felt like a kind of hate. I used to practice. I used to test those limits. I would check in at night at 10 p.m. when we had to sign in for the night and show our face to a faculty member. And then I would turn around and go right back out the door and stay out. And they watched me do it. Nobody said a word. They knew, they knew that they couldn't touch me. And in the midst of this, there was a boy on the ice hockey team. He was my age, but a year behind me in school. Similarly huge, and ordinarily the sort of person I had decided I would no longer talk to in my life, who was blazingly smart. He wanted to be a constitutional law scholar. He was the son of a Rhodes Scholar himself, but he was also a gifted athlete. And he and I struck up a conversation, and he hated St. Paul's too. And he had known everything that had happened. Everybody knew what had happened. And he also knew these guys who had done this to me. They were his teammates. And in many ways, he might well have been cut from the same cloth, except that he wasn't, except that he was a good man. And he he was able to heal something that I don't know would have been healed otherwise, or certainly not at that age. He also, I should say, was deeply respectful of how I felt about my body at that time and wasn't interested in doing anything other than spending time with me in a way that was remarkable. Yeah.
I really was so grateful that he entered, that he was in your life. And when he said, you didn't think it was you, did you?
I asked him, yeah.
It's just a moment that must have really been an important moment for you.
This guy who trapped me, the one who called me the hockey player, I call him Rick Banner in the book. And since this book has come out, actually, there have been other people who've come forward with allegations of assault. In one case, physical assault. He pulled a knife on a classmate when they were sophomores in the dorm and grabbed him and threatened to cut his throat. The person whose throat he threatened to cut became an Olympic rower, actually. So these are big men. These are very big men on a campus with no parents. Everybody in a dorm. It really was more than a hint of William Golding. But I said to Alex, I asked him about this guy who I call Rick Banner. And I said, has he always been like that? Has he always been? And Alex stopped me, and it terrified me when he stopped me because I didn't know what he was going to say. And he turned me toward him and he said, "You thought it was you? Oh my God, you thought it was you?" And it was the first time that it had been suggested to me that it wasn't actually my fault or something in me that these boys had seen that made me vulnerable or in some way foolish or available. All the ways that we make girls and women share the blame for the choices that men make about their bodies. So yeah, once Alex and I grew close and our relationship was, popularly known on campus, he was basically kicked off the ice hockey team by the very same coach who, was a dean and who threatened my father that he would call me a drug dealer and that I was promiscuous and maybe I had given his boys herpes and, all of these things. So the school had taken sides pretty clearly, and people who were publicly supportive of me paid a very high price.
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, we would all treat each other well. Do you think is there any case to be made for segregated educations in those ages, in those years?
Well, I think of course there is. I mean, I'm not an educator, and I resist sort of strict gender categories. I think if we switch to all boys and all girls, that we are creating other problems in the course of solving problems. But I think the greater challenge for a school like St. Paul's, and this applies to high schools everywhere, certainly, is that the power hierarchies that are there tend to be tethered to boys and sports and whatever form of power looks like in that community, which is usually money and whiteness, right? And within that, anybody who is marginalized or can be subjugated in some way is going to be subjected to some form of violence. And the problem then is that if she speaks up, or if the police speak up on her behalf because her pediatrician reported, then the school has a problem on its hands. And what schools need to do is consider each one of these events as a roadmap for what they can do better. But unfortunately, what the schools tend to do is hire lawyers to make it go away.
Right.
And it's become it's an industry. It's a cottage industry now, basically, is addressing sexual assault on campuses.
I think you mentioned I don't know where it was, in an interview or in your book, that you had heard from quite a few alumni, like 75 or something, and that 26 of them in your sort of age range had reported.
That number's got, yeah, I'm trying to remember when in the summer you would have, because I keep updating those numbers. So Vanity Fair ran an excerpt of my book, went live at the end of June, about a week before the book came out. And then the New York Times ran a profile 72 hours later. And in that 72-hour period, my whole life changed in ways that I could not have anticipated. And some of them were really heartening. So I started keeping a list of people who had contacted me so that I could be sure to write back to them. Most of them were emails, but some of them were direct messages that came in over various social media platforms. And that list turned into a kind of poem. It was really remarkable and breathtaking and sad. And where somebody volunteered to me a story of having been assaulted on the campus of St. Paul's themselves, which many people did, I put a little check mark by their name. So I have this list, it goes pages and pages in a notebook of names with their school year after, you know, what form they were in, which is the word we used for your class. And then there's a little check mark next to their name if they were assaulted there. And if they told me about someone else who was assaulted, then I put the check mark in parentheses. So some people will have 2 check marks and some people have 1. And it is now up to, I've heard from 114 alumni and 47 of them have told me about their own assaults on campus. And this, the most recent, the youngest was the class of 2016. She just graduated from college in May. And she was assaulted her 3rd day on campus. The boy who assaulted her was ultimately arrested for rape when he was in college. And she was the first of, I think, 4 or 5 victims by that point. But he had graduated from St. Paul's School without a problem. The oldest alumnus who contacted me was in the form of 63, so graduated high school in 1963. And in those intervening decades falls everybody else. Right. Not all the victims are women, but most of them. And not all the assaults are sexual. Some people were beaten with broken lacrosse sticks or sodomized with paddles, but for the most part, yeah.
With the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh, I mean, really the conversations about sexual assault and how long ago it happened and why didn't you speak up have come up so many times. And you're, you know, this is sort of living proof that, I mean, for so many different reasons, things don't surface when they actually happen.
You know, I love that question because it's sort of an easy pitch for me because I did speak up. I did. So yeah, it took me 5 months to formally tell my parents. That's true. But I went to the infirmary with visible genital herpes 10 days, between 7 and 10 days after the assault. I dated for the physicians when it started. It's all documented. After my pediatrician diagnosed me and contacted Concord Police, and the school conducted its own investigation, they had corroborating. I mean, we have a case file that is everything they say you need, right? And yet, you know, the school said, well, if you put her on the stand, this is what we're going to say about her. And my father said, they're going to ruin your life. They're going to ruin. He said, they will ruin you, is what he said. And he said that with love for me. You know, he wanted a girl who had a future, and that was not. So the only time I spoke up the second time was when the state of New Hampshire opened a formal investigation. I have played by the rules at every turn, you know.
And then you wrote your book.
And I wrote my book, yes.
That's great. So this process of writing this book and, you know, which took a lot of courage to do, I'm sure, and then writing the book, that must have been quite a transformative event, you know, time in your life. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's changed your life, having this book in the world?
Having this book in the world. So the writing of it took place in this feverish, about a 4-month period over the holidays to 2017 to 2018. And this was when I had found out that the Attorney General had severed the Concord Police from my case and would not be including my case. And I could not, when I say I could not stand to be silenced anymore, I mean that not hyperbolically. I think I would have, I don't know what I would have done, but I don't think that I could have accommodated being silenced again. Not after having seen the evidence that I had seen, having been told what I had been told as an adult now. No, I do have some power in the world, and I did too when I was 15, but I didn't know it. And a bunch of men, I think, frankly, realized that the school was on the ropes. They saw what had happened to me. They saw there was medical evidence of the assault. They saw everything lined up, and they knew they were in a whole lot of trouble, and they found out a way to make me go away. And that's what they did. And I couldn't do it again. So for me, writing was easier than not writing, if that makes sense. I mean, it's funny, I sort of liken it. It's kind of a grotesque analogy, but when I was very, very pregnant with my children, I have 3 children, you know, childbirth is really, really, really hard, but there's no other way out of that, right? Like, it's like, you've got to, you're going to go through this, and and it did feel a bit like that. It was a rending of the self, going back to a time in my life that I had put behind me or hoped to put behind me, and revisiting all of that in a way. It's, this isn't an investigative report.
Right.
This is a memoir, right? Since then, I find myself at the center of a whole lot of survivors of assault who are very angry and very hurt, and also trying to live their lives and trying to figure out whether there's any value in going back because of precisely these questions. So what happens is a woman will contact me and say, yes, I was, one woman 2 years behind me was raped by a classmate of mine. She had been a virgin. He lured her into the top bunk during a study hall hour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She could go to the police now, sure. But if she does, they're going to have to corroborate her story as they are. They're going to have to contact all these people from her life. She's a teacher. She's got kids. She doesn't want that in her life. Why would you want that in your life? You wouldn't. So these stories, in a way, have nowhere to go.
But, they do have somewhere to go, because I would imagine that some people who are watching you right now have had similar, somewhat, not as traumatic perhaps, but some similar events, and your reaction to those events has probably helped some people realize that their reactions were similar, and helped to understand why their lives went the way they did. So it is really valuable. And I have to say, in a bit of karmic whatever, you had 3 sons, right? So you're going to send 3 sons out there in the world. Isn't that, unusual to have 3 boys?
Every one of them was going to be a girl until he wasn't a girl. They're still welcome to transition if that's how they feel, but for now, they appear to be fairly masculine little guys. They're still pretty young. I think watching The Hearts of Boys, I wrote a different book than I would have if I'd had girls, I think, because the men who assaulted me when I was 15, neither one of them was a legacy student. One of them was there to play hockey, and he knew it. The other one was a student of color who was there on a significant scholarship. I don't think for a moment those students were made to feel that they belonged or were centered in any way. I think they were the diverse students. They were literally called diverse. Yeah. And their club was called the Third World Society. I mean, it is appalling, the shame that was heaped on people. I think the way we treat men hurts them too. The way we treat boys hurts them too. And so it is not so much about forgiveness. That's not what this is about. It's not even so much about understanding as it is about having a sense that we are all in this together. It's not just me too, it's, us too, them too. And my boys are, they're as easily broken as any girl, right? And they will look for strength where it's offered. And so it's up to me to try to show them alternatives to, the NFL.
Well, I think it's wonderful that you have sons and that you've written this book. I know that there are people who'd like to ask questions, and so I wonder if it's okay for us to open this up, Lacy, to a few questions here.
Yeah, I see. I'm looking at one, which came in a little while ago. Mine would be, says this reader, I hope I have the timeline correct. In what way did the assault by your father's work colleague, this is someone who's read my book, and your mother's reaction when she found out inform how you responded to the assault at school? Thank you, brilliant, insightful reader. That is exactly. So I didn't include this in my information dump at the top of the hour because honestly, we have to get through a VP debate and there's just only so much bad news I feel like any human being should have to take in one day. So I left out the part about something that happened that I think has probably happened to 3 out of 4 women. I would be shocked if it hasn't. Which is that my father worked for an investment bank in Chicago, and someone who happened to have the same last name as the bank and who was a very prominent person in Chicago and a good friend of my parents, his wife too, their kids, we hung out all the time. The summer I was home from St. Paul's in between my sophomore and my junior years, they came out to stay with us and in the summer for the weekend, and he and his wife were in the guest room, and then the little girl was in my twin bed and the little boy was on a trundle in my brother's room. and I was 15 and I couldn't sleep, and I went downstairs to the den, which was where we had the big old TV. You crank the knob, you know, to look for the stations, because I thought I wouldn't wake anyone up. And this man came down the stairs in boxer shorts and a tank top, with a flask in his hand, and wouldn't let me go back upstairs until I gave him a kiss goodnight. And I said, no. I mean, you know, he was this gross bearded man. I just, no. And my father's friend, you know, my father's, I mean, boss in a way, but, and he grabbed me as I ran up the stairs and stuck his tongue down my throat. And then I went into my room and closed the door and got dressed and climbed out the window onto the roof of the garage and dropped down and took off for the night. And when I came back in the morning, my mom, who was nobody's fool, said, "Where were you?" And I said, "Oh, I went on a run." And she said, "Yeah, where were you?" And I said, "Look, I had to get out." And she said, "Did he do something to you?" My mom's instincts are good and were honed by her own experience, but not all women are comfortable sharing these things with their daughters for all sorts of good reasons. And I said he did, and I told her what he had done, and she talked to my father about it, and they decided not to do anything about it except to not have this couple come stay at our house anymore. But it was important that I still be polite to him when we ran into them at social occasions. It was important that that we not talk about this. I understand why. This was 30 years ago. This was long before Weinstein was in the docks. You know, this was a time when, as it so often still does, any of the shame that emerges from the revelation of something like this somehow sticks to the girl. You know, what was she doing out of bed? Why was she in her nightgown? Well, because it was my own house is why. But, you know, you can imagine what would have been said about me. And really, are they going to trust me over a prominent city scion? No, I don't think so. I don't think it would have benefited me at all. That said, the lesson is this will happen to you, and you are not to do anything about it. You know, you keep mum and you keep chasing all of the things that are out there for you to chase, like an excellent college and a career, and most especially a partner and a place in society. And those are things that parents want for their children, whatever form they take.
Right. All right. We've got Pat, are you, I'm sorry. We have a few questions here. We have four.
I just answered the one question, and then we have Pat responding. So I'm wondering if there are other questions coming in. If not.
There is one in the Q&A. Would Lacy talk about the challenges in writing the powerful book? I was struck by its literary skill. What were some hurdles she had to overcome? What other books may have been models or inspiration?
Oh, I don't see that question, but that's a lovely question. Thank you. So the two books that I read exclusively while I was drafting were Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, which is his memoir of growing up the son of a single mother in the Pacific Northwest. This is before he wrote fiction. He wrote This Boy's Life. He is Joffrey Wolff's, Jeffrey, but spelled Joffrey Wolff's younger brother or half brother. And Jeffrey Wolff also wrote an amazing memoir about their father called The Duke of Deception. But anyway, Toby Wolff's This Boy's Life. And then also Laureen Carey's Black Ice. Laureen Carey teaches at Penn. She's a playwright and a novelist and a memoirist, and she was one of the first African-American students on campus and one of the first girls on campus at St. Paul's School. I think she graduated in 75 or 76. And she wrote this beautiful memoir that came out in 1992 about her experience, which to me, to my very privileged and sheltered white eyes, was quite prescient with regard to the experience that Black Americans were having in elite institutions and the direction that those conversations would begin to take. It exposed a whole world of privilege that even living there, I was utterly blind to. And so I learned from Laureen Carey a lot about empathy, and I learned from Toby Wolff a lot about immediacy. I think if you're going to write about something like sexual assault, you need to make it, this sounds awful, but you need to make it a good read, right? I mean, it has to be, the pages have to turn. Otherwise, the material is repellent. It's very difficult. So it was important to me that there also be something of seduction, the enchantment of a story in this. And to the extent to which I pulled that off, it's because I borrowed from those two writers.
You're being very modest.
I'm not. No, I read their books over and over, and then I wrote mine. I mean, I've spent, you know, all my life trying to be a writer and writing, and I, you know, put a novel out, and there are other novels in drawers, and I've written profiles, and you know, I've in some ways been writing this book for 30 years, and in other ways I wrote it, you know, in 3 months. So I think, you know,
It's extraordinary. I see a question in the question and answer. Do you see a question, Lacy?
I read that aloud, but we do have somebody who would like to ask a question aloud, Tucker, and I will allow you to talk.
Okay.
Okay, Tucker, you're all set. You may ask your question.
You have to unmute herself, though.
Yes, you need to unmute yourself. Tucker,
We can't hear you.
okay.
Can you unmute her?
I'm asking her to unmute.
Oh, we have another question in the Q&A section, too.
Tucker, when you're ready, unmute and let us hear it.
Should we go to the other question and then go back to
The other
Tucker?
question, there's one more question in the Q&A. Let me read that out loud. How has your school reacted to your question?
Which question is that? Would be my question. So
Your book, you mean?
yeah, I mean, if that's the broad question is, you know, how has the school reacted to the book?
Yes, the person just rewrote, they meant the book.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So it's funny you should ask. So the trustees and the administration of the school got their hands on a very early version of the manuscript. It was leaked to them somehow after it went out on submission to editors in New York. It was on a very limited submission for exactly this reason. And they read it, I think 8-9 months before it was published. So they read it before my parents had been given the chance. They read it before it was copy edited. I wasn't happy about any of that. People were telling me that they were reading it. I was worried I was going to get sued because of the school's, you know, historical treatment of victims and people who besmirch its lofty name. What ended up happening is the new head of the school, the rector, is a woman. This is her second full year. She is the first woman in, I think, about 160 years of the school's history to lead the campus. There was a fight even naming her, and she came from Middlesex, which is another even smaller New England boarding school. So it's not like, you know, they recruited a woman from a wildly different background or experience. But anyway, Kathy Giles reached out to me last fall, so not quite a year ago, and said that she had read my book and proposed that we speak. And we got together for lunch in February here in California when she was on a nationwide tour just before the lockdown, meeting other alumni. This is a school with an endowment of, what is it, $750 million right now for 500 students at any given point in time. So they have a lot of parties all over the country and all over the world. And she was in Santa Monica for one of these parties, and she suggested I drive up, and I was like, yeah, no, I'd rather chew my arm off than drive up to Santa Monica and meet with anyone from St. Paul's. But she drove down here, and we had lunch, and I was worried that the school would come out against me. Instead, what the school did was meet me halfway. So I had chosen not to sue. I certainly could have. A lot of my fellow survivor alumni have, and there are settlements. I would have been offered a check to walk away. I chose instead, rather than to present some sort of threat to the institution, because I never was. I was a girl. I was a student. That's all I ever was. To try to show how this happens so that we could create a conversation. And Kathy met me there. She met me halfway. They went into my student file, the one that I mentioned Concord Police had read, and from which they had read to me documents that were then, you know, refused by the Attorney General. Kathy went into my student file on campus, and she pulled those documents and she sent them to me. They are verbatim what was read to me, what was in my book, but she effectively gave me the last missing pieces of proof for the puzzle, what I had. And that's not something that most institutions' lawyers would recommend. They issued a formal apology to me, which was a pretty good one as far as apologies go, and as a statement of institutional accountability. And I talked about that with a woman who's endowed professor of philosophy at Dartmouth, who writes a lot about rape and witness and narrative, and she knows a lot about how these stories shake out over time. And I posted bits and pieces of our conversation and of that apology letter on Twitter, and it got a fair amount of attention. And so the Boston Globe ended up writing a piece about how St. Paul's had issued an apology and the apology had landed well. So I think I was able to offer them the benefit of doing the right thing. Is that enough? Do I feel that it's enough? I don't know that there is such a thing as enough. The people who, for the most part, silenced and slandered me are no longer still there. Some of them have died. Some of them are happily retired and living off of their pensions from St. Paul's School, you know, sailing their sailboats off of Kennebunkport, or a lot of them are down in Florida, you know, living the good life. Do I want to do something more? I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to sit in a place of grievance. I don't know if that's an answer to the question or something else, but that's where we are.
That's a good answer. Now we have questions piling up here. We still have Tucker with a raised hand. Tucker, can you mute yourself and then ask your...
Yeah, we need to, or you know what? It could be that Tucker can't unmute because it's a webinar and Pat needs to do it. Did Pat do it? That could be what's going on.
Yeah, I've asked Tucker to unmute and gave him permission to unmute. And
Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. You're way ahead of me. Okay. All right. Well, whenever Tucker, yeah.
I know we don't have a long time here, so are there any other questions that Lacy, while we're waiting for Tucker, I want to, you know, give a shout out to the other libraries who were wanting to participate in this. Nearby libraries, Hampton Bays Library, Cutchogue, Greenport, the Floyd Memorial Library, North Shore Public Library, and the West Hampton Library. So you have a lot of people, Lacy, in these other libraries who are interested in your book and wanted to be a part of it. So
I appreciate that. I love libraries. Thank you, libraries.
now, where are we in relation to Tucker or other?
we've answered all the questions that were written.
Oh, we have. Okay.
We have, yeah. Yeah. So
I'm sorry about Tucker's inability to be unmuted, but I don't know. Maybe that's a.
does Tucker want to type in a question? I suppose that option would have.
Yeah. Well, I think we've sort of, we promised people who wanted to get on to debate.
Debate drinking, debate prep, yeah.
I promised all my friends, don't worry. It will be over in an hour, and it will be. But Lacy, I have to say how much I admire you for writing this book. It was not a book that I was in a way looking forward to reading. This book has helped me. This book would help anybody who read it. I think Marianne Calendro from Canio's bookstore, I think, is in our audience, and I know they have the book. It is a, or take it out of your library. It's a really important book, and I think you've given something quite extraordinary to the world, Lacy, and to us who you have given this hour. We are very grateful.
Thank you so much. I've been so lucky with the book's reception, and I'm really grateful to you for the opportunity to talk about it, especially on a day like today.
Well, you have one additional comment, and it says, excellent presentation. Thank you for your great work and efforts, both Lacy and Penny.
Thank you, Catherine.
Nice. And Lacy, we're going to be watching you. See, we know that you will be writing and writing, and we're going to not lose track of you.
As soon as school starts, as soon as they're back in school with, you know, as soon as we're done with the Zoom thing, then yeah, we'll figure something out. Until then, you know.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pat, for Zoom logistics. And thank you, Lacy, so much.
Everybody stay healthy and vote in that order.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.